We're still on
Then we have a presentation.
And just a note, for everyone, we've begun recording now.
Stick with that.
Fancy.
That's the better.
Yeah.
See, box. Right, you're there. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you all for the invitation to be here. I want to open the presentation by saying that thing thinks my name is Barack. And I, like a few of you here, I'm pretty upset about what happened last weekend, but let's move on. I'm of course talking about somebody named Barack. Again, thank you again, and like to basically talk a little bit about speed limits, how we got here, and a little bit about what maybe you can do if you work for an agency or maybe consulting to work for an agency, how thoughts are changing. It's a little bit of biographical in here because I've been involved in it for quite a long time. If I don't get to any specific questions, I try to give people advice on what they can or cannot do with their specific speed limit problem. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about some of the perspective I've always had, and that's actually reflected in a lot of the provisions of the legislation that just happened right now. There's a lot of ways to get in hold of me. If you remember my name or Google me in traffic, you'll come up with me pretty quickly. We've got some questions for you to ask yourself. If you're in a 25-mile-an-hour zone, how fast can you drive and probably not get a citation?
Within the next 5 miles?
You know, you answer for yourself, but most of you are probably in the mid-30s if you are being realistic. If you're in a 65-mile-an-hour zone, how fast can you drive? Well, most of you people are probably going to be closer to 70 than 65. Then if you're really a scholar on our MUTCD, you know there's guidelines on how to post a comfortable speed around the curve. If you post that comfortable speed around the curve, how fast do you think you can drive before you lose control? Well, I don't know about the rest of you, but if it says slow to 35, I'm figuring I can make that curve pretty easily at 40 to 45 unless there's wet water or snow on the ground. So the bottom line is we kind of live in a world where we're always giving people a 10-mile-an-hour grace for anything that involves speed limits. I don't know why we do that, but if you ask a policeman why, they'll tell you, oh, we give people 10 miles an hour because of speedometer error. Oh, they don't like to admit it, but I know for a fact the fine structure does kick in at higher fines when you get over 10 miles an hour. There's pretty limited traffic enforcement out there, and it's probably getting worse. I was at a meeting up in Washington State a few months ago where the head of their highway patrol said he can't get anybody to apply for traffic jobs anymore. It's just a problem with law enforcement. People just don't want to do it anymore. As a result of that, anytime we want to rely on enforcement, we're relying on something that's probably not going to be there if it involves police. Then lastly, if they are spending time enforcing, they really want to catch the fastest driver they can catch out there for the time they're out there. You know, why would you cite somebody for 30 and a 25 if you know the next person is going to be going 45 and a 25? It makes perfect sense. The 45 is probably more apt to cause issues in the future. So that's kind of where we are. Now, I put the slide in only because I thought maybe a few people here wouldn't know what the 85th percentile was. I'm not going to describe it, but all I can say is we go out and measure the speed of 100 vehicles. We count down from the top 15 and we come up with something called the 85th percentile. And that's always been a value that's been very important in determining how to determine the speed limit. And the state has a lot of laws and procedures that say what you do with that 85th percentile. And that's really what we've been doing. And I do want to say before I go any further, the bottom bullet, back when our speed laws were really originally crafted, there was a lot of concern about setting up speed traps, doing a place somewhere in the middle of nowhere where you had a 55-mile-an-hour road dropping to 25 miles an hour. The local police were citing everybody that had a license plate from out of town, license plate frame from out of town, and so on. And the legislature felt that was really unfair, so they worked to craft a system, which was the California system, which basically is we'd measure all these people and we'd figure what a reasonable speed is, and we would cite people going faster than the reasonable speed. It was probably also at a time where it might have taken 15 or 20 minutes to get somebody going faster than the 85th percentile. If you only had 10 cars an hour, you might have to wait for that. But you know, we've got roads with 20, 30, 40,000 cars a day, and it's not that hard to find somebody going faster than 10 miles an hour over the speed limit. So The police are out there writing tickets almost constantly, but they're writing for values that are substantially higher than the posted limit. So I probably don't have to tell you here, there's been a lot of concern over whether allowing people to drive as fast as they feel comfortable is necessarily good for the safety of people that are not in cars. I've seen many variations of this, but the bottom line is we know that if we get people to slow down a little bit, the potential for a really fatal or serious injury goes down considerably. There's actually research out there that says if you can reduce the average speed on a road by a relatively small amount, 2, 3, 4, 5%, the potential for a fatal collision actually is the fourth power of that. So 1.05 to the fourth is like 125. So if I can induce maybe a 5–10% reduction in speeds on a road, I can potentially see a very substantial reduction in fatal collisions. Injuries is a little bit less than that, but there's a very strong relationship. But we've been kind of arguing that it really doesn't matter if we reduce the speed limit by 1 or 2 miles an hour. Well, the answer is the safety research says it can make a lot of difference if we can reduce the speed by 1 or 2 miles an hour. Now, if you do it on one road and you've got a regression to the mean problem, you had a road with a lot of accidents, and somebody said, oh, we need to raise the speed limit, that probably goes down, and their conclusion is raising the speed limit made it safer. But if you do it on a lot of roads, you're going to not always analyze roads that had a problem in them before. You're going to analyze roads that are average before and average after, and that's where we would expect to see some reductions. We'll see as our new program marches on whether that happens. Now, I've personally always been kind of interested in the protocol that we follow here in the state to establish speed limits. We're kind of unique. Most of the states, the cities or the counties propose to the state what they think the speed limit should be, and the state literally certifies that. So it's kind of done at the state level. We don't have involvement of the state here except on state highways. Instead, we have a pretty deliberate procedure that says, well, you set up your measurement right at this point, you set up right at this time, you do it in light traffic, you don't do it near any traffic signals. So we're basically getting what would arguably be about the fastest speed you could expect on that street to be the 85th percentile. Now, minimizing the effects of signals and stop signs, off-peak hours, don't take it in curves, don't take it near signals. So my conclusion from all of this was the survey speeds we've been doing by following this procedure really are not the 85th percentile for all of the road. They're really only the 85th percentile for the place where the survey was done, which was purposely the fastest place on the road. So our protocol we've been following is really resulting in, I think, speeds a lot higher than 85th percentile of arterials, especially in a city circumstance, because one of the provisions was a minimum of a 1 mile segment. Well, a lot can happen in a city or a developed area in a mile. You can have a very intense area with signals very close to each other. You can have another mile where you might not even have a signal and no access, and we might end up with the same speed limit on that. So I kind of started assembling and cobbling some of the issues I had with speed limits to decide what I want to do with it. Some of the personal experiences I had with speed limits are, I was doing a project for UC Berkeley to study traffic issues in Indian reservation, Native American, First Nation reservations. And they asked about the speed limit on this street. It's one of these little crossroads. It's got a population, maybe 500 or 600. There's a good half mile of this road where nobody drives 55 miles an hour. But because it's only a half mile long, it doesn't qualify for a minimum of a 1 mile segment. So the speed limit on this little place is basically 55 miles an hour. And you have people parking in the country store on one side, running across the highway to get to the park or the service station or whatever on the other side. And it just didn't make any sense to me. So, well, that's one of my examples. Not too far from there, there's a state highway that goes through a bunch of mountain roads. It's posted 55 miles an hour with about 300 curb advisory signs on it, because we can't let anybody go 55 miles an hour under those curves. And yet we can't say, well, most of the road probably should be 40 miles an hour that's posted at 40, and then we only have to post the curves that are lower than 40. Can't do that either under the old plan. Then the last one, Pacific Coast Highway in my neck of the woods, Southern California. On weekdays and during the winter, it's an empty open road. On summer, both sides of the road where parking is allowed are lined with people going to the beach. And I do a major safety study for a place called Malibu that's gotten a lot of headlines for some bad traffic accidents near the beach. And we're thinking, well, maybe with cars lining both sides and people carrying beach umbrellas across the road, we could lower the speed limit. And the answer is no, because you do the survey out there in off-peak traffic and they're all going 60 or 65 miles an hour. So you can't post that one either. So I developed a pretty long collection of reasons to maybe adjust the speed limit. And I started taking it to places like the California Traffic Control Advisory Committee, see if we can at least maybe soften the Caltrans rules for how to take the survey, because a lot of that's really just the Caltrans rule, not the legislation. Then I start running into, okay, it's not an engineering problem, it's really a political problem. And how do engineers deal with political problems? Well, I don't know how we deal with it, but the problem we seem to have is we had a rule for setting speed limits prior to 2009, which had basically a fairly liberal round-off procedure. If you got a survey of 39 miles an hour, you could round it down to 35 and you could round it down again to 30 based upon as simple as the presence of bike lanes or a few pedestrians on the side of the road. So it was pretty easy to get to 9 miles an hour below the 80th percentile prior to 2009. Well, in 2009, some speed legislation was introduced. It was supposed to be speed reform. Had it been adopted the way it was proposed, I think we would have probably gotten a little bit more of a release. But what happened was they stuck a provision in there to change the way you round off. And it basically said you got to round to the nearest, not down to the nearest. So if you got that same street with 39 miles an hour, now you got to round it to 40. But if you had bike lanes, you could round it to 35. Well, that's great. I've still got a little flexibility. But what it means is the street that was posted for 30 now has to go to 35. Well, you had 10 years to reach that decision because you could extend the old survey for 10 years. But as those old surveys expired, you could no longer use the old rules, and you ended up with the cities basically finding, I have a choice. I either need to raise the speed limit to have enforcement, or I need to keep the speed limit where it is and let go of enforcement entirely. So some cities chose approach A, some cities approach B. I think I've cut most of this slide already. But what happened at the same time as cities were finding this, and I know San Francisco and Oakland and a lot of the larger cities were all really finding this happening in a large number of areas. So it really increased the interest by large cities in doing something. And they go to the legislature, and it turns out the legislature is full of people that used to be on city councils and kind of remember having to vote to raise speed limits and having a lot of people think it's a bad idea and a few people think it's a good idea. In the end, they would maybe vote to lower them, and here they were told they didn't have any choice. But at the same time, safe systems and Vision Zero kind of become popular, and agencies are finding that they're identifying these Vision Zero networks, and the next thing you know, they have to raise the speed limits on half of those networks. It really just didn't make any sense. So that really got a lot of legislation discussion happening. And Assemblymember Friedman, who represents a small slice of Los Angeles and all of Glendale, is very active transportation oriented person, rides a bike all the time. It's been responsible for co-sponsoring a lot of the interesting legislation that's happened over the past 10 years. I called her office and said, I don't know exactly what you're doing, but if you're trying to do something with speed limits, I have a lot of interesting ideas I'd like to share with you. The next thing I know, this thing called the Zero Traffic Facilities Task Force was created, and I was on it. And I think I know why I was put on it, but I turned out to be about the only consultant on it. A lot of people from the cities I mentioned were having these problems were on it as well. But I, in my semi-retired mode, probably had a little bit more chance to work with the legislators to fine-tune legislation, come up with some crazy ideas that I thought we should put into the legislation. And some of them got in there, and AB43 was drafted. It took more than a year to get it through. The first year they ended up creating this task force. The second year they actually got it through. And I do remember calling legislators, things I've never done as a traffic engineer, is call legislators and say, you have any questions about this? I'd be happy to answer them for you. And I found it was actually a pretty popular idea. We all think things are going to break down around party lines. It really didn't. I would say that it was probably more popular among the blue side of the state, but it got pretty strong support from the other side too. There was certainly plenty of people who were saying, watch out, you're going to create speed traps. And that's always been an issue that we had to deal with anytime we do this. But generally speaking, most of the legislatures on both sides of the aisle did have city council experience, and they did seem to understand the problem, particularly from a city perspective. So with that, about the time that got started, we got a big boost by the federal government when a group called the National Transportation Safety Board released a study of speed limits throughout the country. And they came out with a lot of publicity and a lot of findings that were very similar to what was happening in California. Speed is cited in 30% of all fatalities. They were very concerned with over-reliance on the percentile. The typo on the slide, there is weak evidence that 85th percentile equates to low crash risk. Saw that as I was flying up here on my hand, oh my God, typo, it says the exact opposite of what it's supposed to say. So maybe we'll get that fixed, but the recording, at least if you got my voice. But they basically felt that the speed limits were increasing and somebody needs to do something about that. As a result of that, they recommended that the national MUTCD be modified to downgrade the guidance for using 85th percentile. I, in my spare time, also am on the committee that helps write that. We labored a lot. There's a lot of people that like it the way it is. There's a belief that having a procedure takes it out of politics. And when you put it into politics, things get strange. But generally speaking, the majority of people that participate at that level felt that it's definitely not working for cities. It might be working for rural state highways. It might be working for straight rural roads. But there's definitely a problem with applying it in areas where it just doesn't seem like the percentile is necessarily the safest speed. So the new edition of the federal MUTCD did come out. Many of you probably know that. It's been out for about a month. I got to tell you, you can't use it now yet. You got to wait for California to adopt it. But if the federal version, the state version say the same thing, you can do whatever you want to do with it. But if they're different, you need to wait for the federal version to come out or work through special permission. But federal MUTCD is moving less and less away from guidance. It's still always going to tell you 5-mile-an-hour intervals. There's a debate over whether there should be any suggestion about what the speed limit should be. That's all handled at the state level anyway. But it helped for that to come out while this Zero Facilities Task Force was coming out. So that ended up with AB43. There were fits and starts, but it ended up with a fairly precise set of legislation. I and the people on the committee had a pretty substantial role in drafting the legislation, so we were able to put into it a lot of things that were driving people crazy. The first thing it did was change the round off rule back to closer to the way it was, so you can now round down. And then with the pedestrians, there's still some criteria that has to come out, but with pedestrians and bicycles, you'll be able to go down to 4. So I think I can safely say we're back to a situation where 35 can round to 30, 39 can round to 35, and 35 can round to 30. There are some things that says here guidelines are being developed. There's still a concern over people abusing these things, and I worry that abuse could ultimately unravel it, but I think if people are reasonable and careful, I think they'll come out okay. Plus, this thing called the Judicial Council, they're trying to come up with a way of lower income people not having to pay the fines that higher income people would be able to pay. And they said that that would probably take them until June of this year to get that done. So there's things you can do now, there's things you can't do till June. But some other things that you can do on there that I thought were interesting. If you had done speed surveys before, you knew there was a clause that says you didn't need speed surveys, engineering traffic surveys on a street if it was classified as a local on the state maps. You couldn't find state maps and it met the local road designation, the vehicle code, you could still count it as a local street. Well, anybody couldn't find the maps, wasn't looking. All you have to do is Google the maps and there they are right on the website. But it's been modified, so now it's an either or. If it meets the local street definition, so many houses in a quarter of a mile on one or both sides of the street, or if it's designated as a local street on the state maps, of which most of the minor streets are, those streets are now eligible for the prima facie 25 miles an hour, which is arguable whether it's enforceable, but the bottom line is you can make those streets 25 miles an hour. A lot of cities that I've done speed surveys in have these 2-lane collectors that are on the state system. You can never understand why they were on the state system. Every once in a while, a city would understand, it would actually take it off. Well, you don't have to do that now. If you've got a pretty minimal street that's on the state system, you can probably go 25 miles an hour on it. We also created something called a business activity district. I take full blame for this. My office is located just to the right on that street in a place called Old Town Tustin. I was seeing in places like San Francisco and Oakland, a problem with they couldn't survey a downtown street because the signals were too close. And yet the speeds in those downtown streets were never that fast. And yet they would do 35 miles an hour on a half-mile unimpeded stretch outside of downtown and bring that 30 miles an hour all through downtown. So this was kind of the relief to that. So you now actually don't need a survey to do a 25 or a 20 on a downtown street. I would recommend you make sure that seems like it's a reasonable speed for you. If you've got a one-way street with signals timed for 35 miles an hour, you might be asking for a little trouble, but retime the signals for 20 miles an hour and I'm sure it'll work fine. So but it's to say the legislative process isn't perfect. Just when you think things are right and going the way you want them to go, somebody on the other side gets a provision snuck into there that says must be posted within 5 miles an hour on the approaches. So the bottom line is you have to have 30 on the approach to hit 25. Well, what do you do if you don't have an approach for 25? I recommend more than one person, if you're willing to give up enforcement on the approach, post it for 30 and then enforce the 25 when you get downtown. So that's again, having to do a respectable job to get around problems. It's one of those cases where you think things are going to go out right and then somebody just jams something in there. The exact thing actually happened in that 2009, 2010, that round-off rule was jammed in. And I had cities that never would have supported it the way it was approved. Find they were claimed that they supported it because they supported a version that didn't have that provision in it. And I don't, again, know exactly how that happened, but I've run into multiple cases already where a community that almost qualifies for this business district can't quite qualify because either there's no street approaching it to post 30 or it's posted 35. And, okay, well, you can probably get away with reducing 35 to 30, but it's going to be up to you to follow the rules as best you can. I'm hoping we don't do a lot of abuse of this because it's really abuse that will ultimately unravel it. But I've given you the types of places where I think it'll work. I think if you try doing it there, I think there's a very good chance that we'll have this forever until we get even more. Also, now that I know a little bit more about how the legislative process works, there may be opportunities for doing fine tuning to address some of the problems here. AB 1938 was actually one of the problems. I'm not sure that I felt it was a problem, but people were worried that you could do a survey and I could lower it to this value for this reason, I could lower it to this value for this reason, I could lower it to this value for this reason, I could lower it to this value for this reason. So you end up with a 39, maybe a 20. And they basically said, we really don't want to open up for that much abuse. We were comfortable with that 9 miles an hour over that we had prior to 2010. We'll be comfortable if you use the special provisions which are aimed at protecting vulnerable users and aimed at improving high incident corridor safety. But we really don't want to go up below more than 12.4%. Now, a smart aleck here in the front row emailed me the other day and said, why 0.4? And I smartly told him to put your dad into a computer program, you will get a single digit. Or if you do 103 or 104 observations, then you have to count up 0.1 to get to the 50th percentile. But the bottom line is they didn't want to be 0.5. They want to be
I would have asked
0.5.
the same thing.
It's good to have smart aleck friends because you keep you on your toes all the time. They just didn't want there to be an either or at 0.5. So they said, let's come down a tenth from 0.5. That way we've got absolute control over which way the 0.5s go. So you'll have to live with 0.4, but if you put your dad into computer, we'll with 0.4 you.
Mm-hmm.
So a final thoughts before I get in the way of you and your lunch. Which still isn't here, so I guess I can answer as many questions as possible. No, it is here. A couple final thoughts, including some not on there. A lot of agencies that have done similar larger area speed limit reduction programs have found safety benefits. It's not likely to happen if you study one location, but if you do a change at a large number of locations, I think you're very likely to see overall improvement in the large number of locations. Also, I worded this awkwardly, but it's been shown quite a few times that changing the speed limit seems to have a pretty substantial effect on the number of people that were willing to travel 10 miles an hour over the old posted speed limit. We reduce it from 35 to 30, and all of a sudden the people that were going 46 in the 35 are now going 36 in the 30s. So there's stands to reason that we're not going to see a lot more people getting tickets because of this change. We probably will see people having a little bit higher fines because of this change, but that doesn't bother me. And the judicial council action makes it not bother me anymore. I do feel that people living on minimum wage probably shouldn't be paying as much as people that make a little bit more than that. So I think we're taking care of the fairness issues. So and then enforcement will probably continue to be likely for the people over 10 miles an hour. And I put in the bottom automated enforcement. A few cities here and a few cities in Southern California. I know San Francisco is one of them. I don't know if Oakland was or not, but they've gotten permission to do some automated enforcement, a very carefully laid out program. You can get Kimberly to tell you about the program in 6 months when they decide where they're going to do it, unless they've already decided. That I think will show even more benefits. I also got to say, I got a enforcement ticket for going 36 kilometers an hour in a 30-kilometer zone in Switzerland last year. So I wrote a letter saying I'm from America, and that's like the 27 to 25, and I wouldn't have got a ticket. And they said, Mr. Miller, will pay your fine. Come over and give your speeding presentation to us, and then we'll laugh at you for having your speed limit set by the voters instead by the safety people. I do want to say also, I've been working with UC Berkeley to kind of roll out this program. And we met with a couple of cities that volunteered to have their speed limits looked at, found some commonalities between them. I don't know what all the commonalities are, but one of the things I observed is most agencies kind of have set the goal to minimize the number of speed limits are changed because it minimizes the number of $100 speeding signs you need to change. And I think if you kind of look at your program with an idea of where are my problem areas, what can I do to adjust speeds in my problem areas? I think you may find some flexibility there. I was finding a lot of cities that were rounding up and making no attempt to round down, even though they were perfectly possible that they could do it for their cities. So they're getting some funding to do that in more cities. You might watch for that. In the meantime, maybe some of you attended the webinar I gave on that program a couple of months ago. But this is my last slide, so I'm no longer the person standing between you and lunch, but I'll be happy to answer Mr. Davis's question.
When studies have shown, or like Texas TTIs, that study is showing that the actual collision rate is lowest at the 50th percent. And of course, between the 50th and 85th, could be at 5 miles per hour, frankly.
Typically is.
But are any other studies being done to correlate the speeds that were set by 85th percentile and other speed limits as to the collision rates?
I don't know the answer to that question. I can only tell you that there's a very wide range of collision rates for given streets, the same speed limit. And over and over and over again, the streets that would qualify for a Vision Zero type treatment have the highest rates. And one of the things that you can only reduce speed limits on, I think it was 20% of your network, which is actually a lot if you discount all the local streets. But the data that A&M worked on was mostly Canadian data. And Edmonton, where I was fortunate enough to do some work a few years ago when I worked for a half Canadian company, they've had a very aggressive Vision Zero program in Edmonton, which includes some of their deep studies of speed limits. And they're reporting very successful overall collision improvement trends there. Now, they, like most other countries, also can do limited automated enforcement. So most people here believe we probably need, if the police can't be counted on to write the ticket, we need some other system. But if that system continues the speed limit plus 10, we should see that 3 or 4% drop. Plus, there's things you can do. I was going to add a slide, but it's 20 minutes. You can narrow the lanes, you could put in automated enforcement cameras, you can put more speed limit signs. There's a lot of things you can do to squeeze 1 or 2 miles an hour out of the streets. So if you're looking for ways of getting 1 or 2 miles an hour, do that. My last comment is you got to admit you have a problem. And I think there's a problem with high speed limits in dangerous corridors, and this is admitting you have a problem. And now you got a corridor, there are too many people going over the speed limit. Now you got a little bit more motivation to do something about it. Yes.
Can you explain from your experience in Zero Traffic Fatalities Task Force and first confirm that AB43 is only allowed, and the new AB only allowable on non-state highway system? It's not allowed on the state highway system, is my understanding. Can you confirm or deny that? And then the reason why the state highway system is excluded, as my understanding is question one, and then two, I believe you said earlier that the MEGC talks about detaching speed limits from the 85th percentile. This legislation is still very connected to just allowing more flexibility.
This is all connected to California MUTC.
Right.
The national MUTC on speed limit is about that long.
Mhm.
Caltrans, the pages are about that thick. I think there's like 8 or 10 pages in the state MUTC on setting speed limits. I don't know that it'll change that much because of the federal legislation, but the federal legislation, specifically the MUTCD, has said you should examine all the factors. And it's basically said you need to consider the context of the roadway. So built into that language was, if it's not a wide open country road that doesn't have safety problems, probably you don't need to monkey around with the speed limit. But if it's a road with safety problems, then speeding is either speeding or the speed of vehicles is a problem. Now, as for the state, I read it. I wasn't prepared for that question. There are sections that say the State Department of Transportation can do this. There are sections that say local governments can do this. They're not the same. But if you put yourself into the chair of a state highway person and read it to see what the state highway can do. For example, I don't know if, I didn't mention before, if you raise the speed limit because of the changes of the last decade, you can put it back.
Right.
If the state raised the speed limit because of the changes in the last decade, I don't know if you can put it back or not, but it's worth a read to find out. And it won't be that complicated read. Most of it's in 2358.7, I think.
Okay.
So, and if I get asked that question 1 or 2 more times, email me and I will tell you what I think the answer is. It's still only me. And you're still only getting my my interpretation of legislation. We still have a Caltrans document to come out. But I got into a little debate with the Caltrans guys preparing. I found myself on the don't lower it side when he was on the lower it side. So no, if you're done, do whatever you want to do. So you had questions?
Just a quick one.
Yeah.
The California MEPCD that just was issued.
Yeah.
Does not include any of the matters you're referring to.
The California METC that was just issued would be reflective of state law effective recently.
Okay.
And it has attempted to do something like this. But it has some clauses that say you can't do some of this until July 1st
Got it.
of this year.
That's what I thought.
So you need to read for the July 1st.
Sure.
There's things you can do before July 1st. There's things you can do wait until July 1st, and that includes the enforcement, the judicial council work, and Caltrans is working on a definition for an area that has ped and bike activity.
Well, thank you.
And if you already have a high entry network, you may still have to wait till June before you can use that network to reduce speeds. But unfortunately, I keep on having to read it to answer questions, but as long as I'm only getting a question or 2 a day, I'll keep on reading it. And I'm really frustrated about these little mountain communities that don't meet the business activity district. And if there's a way to get that changed, that will be my next task, but I just don't know if I have the energy to go through the legislature again. So Ms. Friedman, what can I do next? She's termed out, so I need a new Ms. Friedman to take my place.
That's a lot. You find stuff.
Yeah, great. Yeah, a lot of it happened because she became the chair of the Assembly Transportation Committee. When she was a member, she couldn't get out of committee, but when she became the committee chair, that's the way the legislature works. Any other questions? Yeah.
Aside from street design, is there any advocacy on technology within the vehicles, reducing speeds?
The vehicles have the capability. The presentation I edited to make this one had the line, well, every car I've owned in the last 5 years knows the speed limit. I know there's been discussion at the state level about implementing that so they can't go faster than the speed limit. That's the kind of legislation that's going to have a little uphill battle. And I don't know what it's going to take to get through. I know with Ms. Friedman no longer on the committee, I don't know who that chair is going to pass to, but I know so much more about politics than I did 10 years ago. And I never talked to a legislator in my entire career until this all happened. I found myself having to do it. I found, you need an army with you. It doesn't happen because one person, but it happens when somebody wants it done and points this task force to come up with 30 or 40 people that say this to counter the 1 or 2 people that say that. And that was really what it seemed to come down to.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So, following up on that question, I've been thinking about it, but, wouldn't it be require federal legislation, not state, for the, vehicles to actually not to go further than the speed?
It's always a blur what the feds can do versus what the states can
Oh,
do.
I see.
The feds, to get their way, usually threaten to withdraw funding. And then the states agree to comply with Fed to do that. Whether it would ever come to that or not is a good question. A general NETCD question I've asked people on that committee longer than me. When have the feds actually ever formally threatened to remove federal funding? And the answer was having to do with 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. So it has to be a pretty serious issue before the feds would actually exercise that power. But rather they say, we really don't want to have to do this. Why don't you just kind of modify your document to be like us? But we'll let you keep your yellow crosswalks because you've had them for longer than we have federal government. So, let's do lunch and I'll stick around after for personal questions, anything like that. I didn't mean to put you on the floor, but I did mean to put you on the floor.
It's fine. This group knows me too well. Yeah.
Yeah.
2010. No, Chair. You know, look at that bad job, except there's the four computers. Oh, God. Oh, God.